Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a minute as we're waiting for people to enter the room. Thank you for joining us for Joys and Challenges of Leadership in Higher Education. I see people entering the room now. Just give it one more minute and then we'll get started. All right, 12:01, we're ready to go. So welcome to the Joys and Challenges of Leadership in Higher Education. My name is Sean Devendorf. I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving here at Tufts. I am delighted to be joining you for this is the 5th event in this series of virtual conversations centered around leadership in higher education. And this series has been recorded, so if you missed any of the talks, they will be available on the Tufts Alumni YouTube channel. So we are navigating a time of significant global and national change. These shifts are being felt on our campus and across our communities. And this series was designed to connect our alumni, parents, and campus community with the inspiring ways our academic and faculty leaders are collaborating, innovating, and guiding us through these transformative times. I'd like to thank Eileen Babbitt, Professor of the Practice of International Conflict Management, for being our featured guest, and Vice Provost Monroe France for hosting this series. So today's event will be a conversation between Eileen and Monroe that will include many of your pre-submitted questions. And now I'd like to give a brief introduction of Monroe before turning it over to him, and he'll provide a short introduction to Professor Babbitt. So Monroe France is the inaugural Vice Provost for Institutional Inclusive Excellence at Tufts and a Professor of the Practice at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life. Monroe serves as a member of the President's Cabinet and is charged with guiding Tufts' strategy for advancing institutional inclusive excellence. Previously, Monroe served as Senior Associate Vice Provost for Global Engagement and Inclusive Leadership at New York University. Monroe has a track record of providing strategic consultation and coaching on change management, inclusive and innovative leadership, as well as organizational assessment and transformation to senior leaders and executives across the globe. Monroe is often invited to present on the future of work and talent, leadership during times of crisis, and approaches to fostering effective global partnerships. Monroe is also a visiting thought leader for Weatherhead University in India. So please join me in a virtual welcome for Monroe France. Monroe, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you to the Alumni Office for your incredible partnership in this series. Could not do it without you, could not do it without our tech people who worked in the behind the scenes. Marianne, shout out to you as well, and to just everyone for helping us to create a more inclusive environment across all of Tufts. That includes our alumni community and our parents as well. I hope everyone's taking care, and you're not only taking care of yourself, but we're taking care of our community and of each other. I just have this lovely privilege of introducing Professor Eileen Babbitt today. She has become just such a really incredible and cherished partner in this work. And so we've been responding to these different moments across campus over the last year and a half plus. Eileen Babbitt is a professor of the practice of international conflict and management, as you heard Sean say, and also the former director of the Henry J. Leir Institute at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's a faculty associate of the program on negotiation at the Harvard Law School. Her research interests include identity-based conflicts, coexistence, and trust building in the aftermath of civil war, and as well the interface between human rights concerns and peace building. Her practice as a facilitator and trainer has included the work in the Middle East, the Balkans, and as well with the United Nations, U.S. government agencies. And I've done a lot of work with the United Nations, which I don't think we've even talked about before in the past, Eileen. And she's a regional intergovernmental organizations and international and local NGOs work she's done before. And before joining Fletcher, Professor Babbitt was the Director of Education and Training at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., and Deputy Director of the Program on International Conflict and Analysis and Resolution at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. So as you see, we have an expert in this space today, and it's just so wonderful to see you. Most important question as we start, Eileen, how are you today? And how are you navigating these really thorny global times? And how are you restoring and taking care of yourself? So let's start there. Let's start with the pleasant part of everything.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'm going to probably ask you back as well.
Sure.
with friends and family and colleagues,
Mm.
staying grounded
Mm.
as possible, having supportive conversations, and focusing on caretaking, if that's the correct word, with our students, making sure they're okay and being there for them day to day. And we just had at Fletcher a day-long meeting last week on how the field of conflict resolution might be responsive in these difficult moments. So we gathered a group of scholars and practitioners in the field, mainly from other sister institutions in the Boston area. It was very affirming. You know, people are looking to each other for support, as I said, and also trying to think creatively about how we use our skills and values in this challenging moment.
That's the same way for me too. I would say that, I was just at a conference with diversity officers from across higher education and beyond, right, in
Yeah.
Chicago. And that was just such an important moment to be in community with people. Some of their jobs have changed and refocused depending on the institution. So hearing their journeys is helpful to understand. But being in community is so critical right now. And also understanding where we can be in partnership and solidarity with each other has been incredibly important for me too. So
Exactly. Good.
Page and some walks and some like and watching some things on TV sometimes that just frees up the mind, right? Those little things, the little things in life, the little things.
It's true.
Well, let's get into it. Tell me about your journey to now and what inspired you to do the work in international conflict management. And, I often ask this question, was there an aha moment where you said to yourself, as the young Eileen Babbitt, just thinking about the big dreamy world coming in front of you, where you're like, this is what I want to do. This is what my calling is. So tell us just about your journey and how you've gotten here. And if there was a particular aha moment that led you to where you are now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you posed this question to me ahead of time, and I thought about this, I don't want to go back to, I was born in a small town in central Massachusetts, but I was. But
Fair.
but a couple of things stand out for me. One is getting involved in many of the social movements, the social and political movements of the 60s and 70s. That is my generation. And I was a little young to be active in the civil rights movement, but certainly followed it closely and carefully. And then, of course, there was the pushback about the war in Vietnam, the women's movement, and then the anti-nuclear movement, that was called the weapons freeze movement, the nuclear freeze movement. Some of you may remember all of these things, some of you not, depending on your age. But the accumulation, I think, of all that for me was the importance of empowerment and voice, and how to amplify that. And beginning to feel both personally and collectively, I guess, the importance of being part of these very important expressions of concern. And as you know, within these movements, there's also a lot of disagreement. So also seeing what the challenge is, where there's some things that you share, but you have different ideas about how to move on those shared concerns. So that was what prompted me to come back to graduate school. I already had a degree in public health, and was working in an educational context doing public health work. Came back and went to the Harvard Kennedy School. And it was there that I had the aha moment. So I took a course. I was planning on working on, I think, environmental policy, and anyway, and decided to take a course on negotiation. And that was my aha moment. I studied with this amazing professor, Howard Rafa, who's now deceased. And it was, I've told my students this, it really was a moment of a light bulb saying, this is a structure. This is a rigorous, analytical, and yet empowering structure to bring people into the conversation. And that it's a set of skills people can learn. It's not only an inclination and a motivation and an aspiration. It's a set of skills you can actually build. And I decided that's what I wanted to do, was to help people, particularly to encourage and engage people in the public sphere. In public policy, both domestically and internationally. How do we get people's voices in those spaces where leaders, political leaders, are making decisions affecting our lives, and we as citizens maybe feel, maybe even like now, a bit powerless? How do we get into those spaces, and how do we have the skills to say what we believe?
I love this. I love how you take and translate scholarship, like the scholarly piece, into skills, concrete methods that can actually be applied to impact change, right? And, and that piece around feeling more empowered, right? What you're saying, giving people some access to power and agency.
Exactly.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So you are in the trenches, right? So you've done all kinds of like conflict negotiations all around the world, right? And we've mentioned some of the places you've done the work. And so, and then you became a teacher. I like to say the teacher, right? Okay, a professor, right? Yes, you became a professor in the classroom. What motivated that transition into the classroom? And do you still consider yourself a practitioner? And what lessons have you learned from your students as well? I'm curious, by being in class, in the laboratory. Yeah.
Yes. There is. I don't know if this term has gone out of fashion, but I very much think of myself as a scholar practitioner.
Same here.
That is the term. And because I believe, as I'm sure you do, Monroe, that the practice informs the teaching and the conceptual work. It's all interconnected. And to the extent you stay engaged in the practice, you're able to bring more of the world into the classroom. Before I started teaching, I was at the U.S. Institute of Peace as an administrator running education and training programs. I had also been a consultant doing work with clients, primarily in the public sector and primarily in the United States, although not exclusively, doing, both consulting on negotiating processes and training in negotiation, mediation, et cetera. And I decided I wanted something where I had a longer time to spend with people. I instead of spending 2 days, I get to spend 2 years, I mean, it's still a short time, but it's more of an extended engagement. And it's very much about prioritizing the next generation. And making sure, to the extent I can, that these skills and values and practices are passed along. And also the fact that in the university, of course, you can also be more reflective. When you're a practitioner, the pace is pretty fast, and as you know, and you have to be there for the clients and et cetera. But in the university, there's an opportunity to take a step back and think about what you're doing, write about it, teach about it. So I was ready to do that.
That's beautiful. What have you learned from your students? Anything like what lessons being in the class that give you a sense of possibility and hope in the work?
Well, the fact that the conflict resolution field has been one of the top 3 fields at Fletcher for the whole time I've been there. So 25 25 years. I've been at Fletcher 25 years or 26 years or, way too long, I guess.
Right.
And it's been one of the top 3 fields. So this makes me hopeful
Yes.
that people are looking to learn about this work, both the theories and practice.
Mhm.
If even, not even, but many are going also focusing on security studies, and they're
Yep.
seeing the integration of the use of quote unquote hard security and the skills of conflict resolution and human security. They're seeing that there's a need for the integration. That is very, very encouraging to me.
Mm. Mm.
That students come in
Mm.
with that notion. They're not
Yeah.
quite sure how to put it together as a professional career path,
Mm.
but that's where they want to go.
Yeah.
And that gives me great hope.
Yeah, I think, this generation coming forward, and as we go forward, it's just going to have to be the way of the world, I believe, is that we break down the silos and disciplines in practice, right? That we look at a more integrated model for how we think about this work, because complexity is going to continue to develop, especially with technology. So I love that thinking. I love that thinking. So during your travels, the work you've done to develop trust and peace building during times of conflict, as you've mentioned, when this has come up with some of the questions people had about protests too a little bit. I'm just seeing coming in the side like question
Okay.
chat, but not protests per particular, but I'm just thinking, what are some of the greatest lessons you've learned in the field, right? And how you help build peace? Like, what are some elements that you're like, these are true and trusted things I've done? I've seen you put some things in place, like even at the campus we're going to talk about later, but some to some degree. But is there, and also is there a particular experience, right, in terms of thinking about storytelling, a story or an experience that you would share with everyone as an example for where you've seen that magic work? Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Also been thinking about that quite a bit. And I have to say there are, I guess, 2 experiences that stand out for me.
Mhm.
One is early on in the 1990s when I was part of a group of non-governmental actors who went to the countries of the former Yugoslavia when the war in Yugoslavia broke out. This was 1992. And we were invited by civil society organizations, very active. The country had a very active civil society before the war, and amazing people who, in the midst of the most horrific circumstances, wanted to help their communities weather the storm and come out in a better, well, I don't know, better place, but at least in a civilized and connected place. And through networks, we and 2, 3 or 4 of my colleagues were connected to them. It was an amazing experience, Monroe, honestly, to see people under really under the most devastating circumstances. And I know my colleagues experience this all the time who do humanitarian assistance work as well, and human rights work, is the courage
Hmm.
of people in the local communities and the wisdom that they have. We have to get over this. I'm from the outside and I'm coming to tell you what the best practices are.
Right there. Yes.
No.
Yep.
I mean, I can share my experiences with you, but I want to hear from you, and we work together on this because people are so wise
Yep.
and they know their communities so well,
Mm.
and they've stepped up
Mm.
in the most devastating circumstances.
Mm.
Um, I found this also to be true doing work with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I've been
Mm.
working on for 25 years. Same experience of amazing people under extremely difficult and trying circumstances and ups and downs over the years, as everyone on this webinar knows,
Mm.
who stay the course
Right.
And they're really putting their entire being into trying to create civility and connection.
Mm.
And I just admire them, and they're so inspiring to me. And what I have learned in both of these circumstances is the extremely important element of connection
Ah,
and rehumanization, because what happens in these especially extended conflict circumstances, the dehumanization is extraordinary and incredibly destructive.
mm,
And there have to be, and this is what the people reaching out want to learn about, is what are the processes by which we
mm,
continue to engage each other's humanity. And so that I think is the biggest lesson is, number one, the wisdom and courage of whomever you're working with, and
yeah.
listening to them, and B, the importance of connection and humanizing the communication.
Thank you. Those are really, really powerful points. And I felt it when you said, like, you have to make people feel humanized again, right? Because
Yeah.
often during war and conflict, we're always like dehumanizing the other, right? And so, and how do we build back up that sense of, I have strength, I have assets, right? And then, like, and that can be how we can help facilitate that. And then they do it on their own, right? In terms
Yeah.
of what they need for their own community. So
Yeah.
so you've, like, in addition to all the great things you've talked about, you've had a very, as they say, illustrious career, like in terms of, and I find fascinating, right, personally, right, and I hope everyone else does too that's joining us today. You've directed an institute, you've directed numerous programs, you've led teams, and you facilitated complex conversations. So I want to get into the leadership part of it all, right? And
Yeah.
so we've talked about, throughout the series, right, I am very, very interested in how people sort of operationalize their leadership and how they think about it, right? And what makes them lead in the way that they do. And so as a praxis. So how would you describe your leadership style as you're working across contexts? And, what have you found to effectively lead across difference during conflict? And you talked about some of it just a moment ago, but then what, tell us about your leadership style? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you probably should be asking the people who've worked with me
Of course.
instead of me.
How have you experienced your leadership style? That's what I would
Yes,
ask.
okay, yes, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. But I'll try to be self-reflective.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
So I hope what I try to do is walk the talk.
Mm,
In a leadership capacity, I try to do what I recommend
yep.
as a conflict resolution professional,
Mhm,
which is listen,
yep.
and listen not to judge or
Mm,
to argue or debate,
mm,
but listen to truly understand what people are thinking, feeling, concerned about, etc. So creating a space where that kind of exchange can actually happen and people feel comfortable and safe saying, here's what's happening with me, etc.
yep.
Number two, to be facilitative
Mm,
as well as directive. Um,
yeah,
as the leader, you do have to make decisions, obviously. Um,
right.
so you don't want to completely sidestep that part of the job, but to be consultative and facilitative and find out what your people need and help them get those things,
Mm,
both in their professional lives and in the substantive capacities that they're working. A lot of what you do running programs and centers is fundraising.
yeah.
How do you do that collaboratively? How do you find out from people what they need, and how do you figure out how to try to get it for them or help them get it?
Mm,
And the third thing, I guess, is really about teams. Uh,
yep.
One of the things I really try to do is bring people together
Mhm,
so that it's not just me and you. It's not, totally bilateral, but we're a group. You know, we're a community. When I was the head of the Leir Institute, we had very regular, everybody together lunches, and we'd go around the table and hear what everyone was doing. And people really, really appreciated it. Now, this was pre-pandemic.
Okay.
So I imagine, and I'm sure that leading
Yes.
during and after that makes things much more challenging, and people have gotten used to much more virtual connection. I do know many colleagues doing online conflict resolution work, that there are strategies for building community virtually.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's so that there's no excuse. If,
Right.
yeah, even if you're doing it, have to do it virtually, that doesn't mean there aren't methods and important ways of making people feel included and heard.
And in some ways, depending on your teams, it can create more accessibility because, like,
That's true.
especially if you have team members who are absolutely virtual, right? Because we know that the way people work and live has changed since the pandemic. I wanted to follow up on one question or one point you made about developing team.
Yeah.
How have you thought about the balance between, okay, it's us, and getting, like, that sense of, like, it's only about us, our own needs, and how do we use that as a method to facilitate engaging across, reaching out, being able to build relationships across the other? So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, very, very good point. And yes, because that, in the world of research on social psychology, there's a lot of attention paid to the tension between maintaining the cohesion of one's own group and connecting to others outside of that group. And that, of course, is one of the core skill sets of conflict resolution as a practice. So yes, the idea of and what are our networks?
Yes.
That yes, we are a team, and there's a boundary here that we would like to strengthen because we have a lot in common, and who are the people we want to connect to. So it's a kind of social networking analysis. Who are the not even like-minded. Who are the people, the institutions, the projects we feel are important to connect to in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, and how do we make those connections? I think that's a really important point, Monroe.
Yeah, no, thank you. And when I'm hearing you say that intentionality and going back to what you said, that the conflict resolution work gives you a method for doing it, right?
Exactly.
For doing it.
Exactly.
So you said earlier as well that, the women's movement inspired you. So we are in Women's History Month, right? We just Saturday had International Women's Day, which you know how apropos given your work as well in the international context. And so tell me about your journey in this space, right, as a woman. Have you seen, like, the field shift over times in terms of more gender inclusion? How has it been for you to be in conflict-torn places where, you've had to go in and maybe, like, ways in which they think about, like, patriarchy, matriarchy, and all those things, and like it may be at a range of experiences. So tell me just about how that has shown up for you.
Very interesting question. I mean, in the early days of my career, which were the 1980s, many decades ago, the primary leaders of the conflict resolution field were primarily, not exclusively, but primarily men. Of course, that wouldn't surprise you. And white men. And the three men who were the three people on my dissertation committee were all white men, whom I loved dearly, by the way. And they were tremendous mentors, really, really exceptional mentors. So, and that of course has changed over time. There was we had in the late 1980s, I think it was, a gathering in Washington, D.C. of what we called the next generation
Okay.
people in the conflict resolution field. And it was notable that at least 50% of the people in that meeting were women. And women who had studied under these very significant and accomplished men, but had been mentored well by them. So there's been an evolution, absolutely, just like in many fields. I don't think, I think that the work also has benefited enormously from an attention to local level efforts, which means that people are taking leadership roles at the community level from all races, ethnic backgrounds, and gender, of course, because in their communities, they are leaders. And that's been an evolution in the field, is to support local level efforts, and the ones that are initiated and run by local practitioners, many of whom are women.
This is beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts that may not necessarily always be popular considerations under this current context, but I still stand by this, that, women have always had to be across cultural context, right? Across cultural context, innovative in ways which that they've had to figure out how to access power more creatively and also build their own pathways forward, right? And so they work together in community and have models for things that if we gave access and resources, we can learn a lot about ways to solve more world problems, right? And so, I think that's so critically important. And I want to take us to Tufts. And so as I said in the beginning, I'm so appreciative of the leadership that you provided and guidance you provided to us during a time that was really complicated and challenging. And not that we still have recovered from it, not at all. And we're just seeing other remnants of it now in our society at this very moment. So not only the US more broadly too, but after October 7th, right, in 2023, we needed support creating spaces for our community to engage across our our belief systems, perspectives, and to reflect, to just be a community of reflection. And so you first co-hosted a space in Fletcher that I was able to attend, and that's when we first met.
That's right.
I was just like, who is this woman? I got to know her, right? And then we tapped into you for other opportunities across campus to help us facilitate spaces. And so why did you step up? Why did you decide to move and stretch yourself outside of Fletcher to offer your support to our campus community? What did you learn from that moment? What are you still reflecting on? What have you found successful? So just what are some of your musings about that time? So not that, again, that we're completely out of it, but just in that acute critical moment, how you provided support and what and why and what did you learn?
Well, I have to credit also our dean, Kelly Sims Gallagher at Fletcher, who reached out, immediately on October 7th. I mean, on the day, and contacted me and said, "Okay, what are we going to do?" And not just me, but a small group of us. And my immediate response was, we have to bring people together to hear how they are feeling and how they're processing this. There's a million policy questions and legal questions and moral questions, and we will get to that. But first, we just have to let people come together and know that we're going to support them as a community. So that's what we did. And the reason I did it, Monroe, I don't know, it just seemed so obvious to me that that was necessary. Such a fraught moment where you knew that there were going to be different points of view, and it was going to be very difficult to manage that without some guidance and some, we call it a container, some kind of space that felt okay to say, this is how I'm feeling right now. It's not the whole answer. I mean, I don't mean to paint this as being the magic bullet or something. That's a terrible phrase when we're talking about peace, but the panacea that is going to be the end of violence and conflict. No, but there does need to be a space created, and it just seemed obvious to me, and that I have done this, and so I thought, well, this is one small way I can contribute something to this very difficult moment. So I did, and I think the important thing was creating a set of guidelines that became the agreements we make with each other about how we're going to treat each other in that space. And I was able, thankfully, because of you and others at Tufts, to bring that same process to the engineering school, the School of Arts and Sciences, the medical campus. And one of the things I learned was what an amazing place Tufts is. And people really, they came into that space really in pain. I mean, really, personal difficulties beyond measure, and were able to sit and hear each other. So that was stunning and very inspiring to me.
Yeah, no, this was at a time in which that, and again, not that we still don't have these moments, but it was at a particular time where we needed people willing to take some risk, right? And I know it was a risk. It was a risk for Kelly saying, come on, you all see side chatter. Let's just get together as a community. And some people on campus are like, oh, what is she doing, right? And others appreciated the willingness. And then for you, like in some of your other faculty colleagues to step forward. And then, like you said, you replicated that moment where not knowing what people were going to come in with per se, but knowing that people were hurting and wanting space, right? And so thank you for that work. And, and since that time, we've continued to try to create moments and opportunities for education. So we launched an orientation session that focused on anti-Semitism, that then broadened into other conversations around Islamophobia, around like racism, anti-Blackness, around like we have one coming up for political polarization. We have another conversation coming up very soon on transphobia and trans rights, and then one we're in around disability. And so our Tufts Inclusive Education series. So we've tried to create these spaces and moments for learning across difference in a dialogical model, right? And so
that's great.
It goes on peace building work. It's really about the peace building work, right?
It is. And kudos to you, Monroe, for pressing ahead with this in an environment where there's hostility toward doing this kind of work for reasons that are not even clear. But there is, and we go ahead, we do it because this is we have a campus community that we're trying to support. So good for you.
Thank you. Thank you. And there's a question that came up from the side, like a Q&A. So thank you for those who have submitted questions. We won't be able to get to all of them because we had some pre-submitted questions as well. But I had already planned for a question that's very similar to the one that we received in the chat, in the Q&A. So I'm going to like string them together, thread them together. So, my question for you is, do you think that conflict and war and violence are inherent in diverse societies? And like, in that, like this tension point, right? Is that inherent? If not, or what are proactive ways leaders can take to disrupt that, or to create societies, or the people itself, the citizens, right? What are ways in which that we can do to try to mitigate that if it is inherent, or is it not? I don't know. This is the question, right? And in that question, coupled with that, we got is that, do you think there's a way for people who have not been interested in this field now to come into it, especially during these troubling times, right? And so So people who have not been interested, how can we get them there? And then also,
Yep.
is it inherent and how do we navigate that? Yeah.
Yep. Come one, come all is my response. We need you.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of ways. I'll get to the first part in a second.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
There's all sorts of ways to engage with this kind of work. You don't have to have a degree in conflict resolution. There's all kinds of ways to get training, and there are myriad organizations doing amazing work in this country and in almost all countries, this kind of work. So there's many, many ways to connect and engage. So yes, and I'm happy to talk with you, whoever you are, about how we might do that. Conflict is inherent. There is no non-conflictual society. Conflict is part of human experience, and it can be quite constructive. I mean, conflict basically means we disagree on something, and heaven forbid we should all be the same. I mean, that wouldn't be great either. Then we'd be the Matrix or something, we don't want that. So so difference is good and conflictual. The point of conflict resolution in the field is to figure out ways of managing those differences that are the least destructive. Least destructive of relationships, and of and that are hopefully not violent, that they're, and by violence here I'm talking physical violence, but also structural violence. I mean, we're trying to mitigate any ways in which people are damaged. Can we do that all the time? No. Sadly, no. But with that as a frame, then the question is, how do we prevent it when it's possible to prevent? And how do we mitigate the damage if prevention fails or we just don't get there in time? And so that's what I think we're trying to do. And, it looks at the moment as if we're failing miserably, at least in the United States. And that's very distressing. I do want to tell you, though, that there's an enormous amount that's going on that may not be apparent. The airwaves are dominated because of the way that the incentive structure is with news, with everything that's bad and horrible. And it is bad and horrible, but there are things happening that are actually quite constructive, and people are reaching out in all kinds of ways. So I'm not completely hopeless.
Yeah, no, that is like very, very true. And we don't often get in the media sensationalization of this moment, the examples where people are really coming to community together, strategizing how they're trying to support one another and coming and working together across differences. And not just in our own inner areas of interest, right? And this,
That's right,
time which we have to see our humanity bound to each other, to the planet, to the animals, to all of that, right? So
that's right.
To protect the planets and the animals as well. We ruin and disrupt the ecosystem. So that helps all of us to survive, right? And
That's
so
right. That's right. And it really is about, at this moment, I believe, it always is, but particularly at this moment, it's about coalition building.
Yes.
And about finding the various ways in which people are working on community and connection and civility, et cetera, and partnering across, horizontally, vertically, across countries as well as across communities. That's the task, I think, at the moment.
Beautiful. So beautifully said. So we have a question. I'm going to take it exactly how it was written, a pre-submitted question, and maybe this person is on. So the question was, as a former, I'm looking forward to this event, is what they first said, right? So they're very much excited about the event. But as a former assistant dean at Fletcher, director of the Tufts European Center, and among other Tufts administrative duties over my 23 years at Tufts, I wonder how much more difficult this type of roles are now at this time. Thoughts about that? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it does seem that the prevailing norms of interpersonal and intergroup behavior are changing, and that the boundaries of what's acceptable in terms of how we engage with each other are being pushed and sometimes simply ignored. And that does make it a lot harder because we have to, this is why the discussions that I and others host usually have come with a set of guidelines.
Sure.
Because there is a need to create some kind of, I don't know, rules of engagement. What is acceptable in terms of how we talk to each other, and
Right.
you negotiate this in any relationship.
Absolutely.
You negotiate this with your spouse,
with your children, even, right?
right, with your spouse, with your roommates, if you have with other members of your family. How many articles do you read every November about what to do at Thanksgiving dinner?
True.
You know, so it's creating a set of even if they're temporary norms about what's going to guide how we engage. And the models out there are changing. So we have to reinforce the more civil guidelines and state them clearly and ask people, are you willing to engage with these as the guidance? I think it has to be, we now have to be more explicit about that, rather than assuming that everybody's on the same page about what is and isn't acceptable. So that, I think, is something that's changed. I don't know, I mean, it's distressing, but it's also helpful to begin to make things explicit. Because if we assume everybody's on the same page, of course, we could be wrong.
Right. And we're for our own mindset, like our own perspective, right?
Yeah,
So,
right. And so now we maybe shouldn't make those assumptions, and that means we have to be more explicit. And that may be, in some strange way, a good thing. So that we are having to negotiate what that space is going to be like and how we're going to engage in that space. Now, that could be workspace.
totally.
Again, the conversations we've had at Fletcher and with the arts and sciences and everything, that was a community coming together. And maybe they don't think on a daily basis of how, what the norms are about how they're engaging. But when they came together in that auditorium and we talked about the guidelines, that then became explicit.
Right.
And what we hope is that then people take that with them into how they interact outside of that room. Hopefully. I mean, it begins to be a conversation that can be had, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no. So we got a related question about sort of navigating protests. Do you have any thoughts about that in terms of ways in which that when things get thorny in protests, what are some ways to maybe bring down the temperature or to help you some proactive means of preparing people to be in these really, really disruptive moments where people are advocating for something, making their perspective known, but maybe falling outside of the bounds of rules and policies, et cetera. So any
Yeah.
thoughts? Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's a hard one. I think I'm a complete free speech advocate. I think people, especially campuses, should be areas for the permission of speech and the First Amendment. I know that also needs to be negotiated. I guess what I would counsel is the administrators need to talk to the students
Mm,
for engaging in the protest.
mm,
Part of why people protest is that they want their point of view to be heard and acknowledged.
mm,
Now,
mm.
obviously, there are demands as
Yeah,
well, or
sure.
often, I know.
That's
Um, but, and there's a
yeah,
conversation to be had about that. And I don't think we can jump over the conversation
right.
and just try to control the behavior.
Mm, mm,
So what is the conversation that needs to happen? Who
right,
needs to be at the table?
right.
Again, how do we set the parameters for what the conversation will entail? What's the follow-up to that conversation? Does there have to be more than one? I mean, this has to be part of the process
Mhm.
rather
Yeah.
than only thinking about controlling the behavior.
Mm. Yes, thank you. Say it for the nosebleeds. So, say for the nosebleed seats, right? Um, so, so we have had a lovely conversation, and I want to end on a note where we're focusing on hope and possibility in the future, right? And
Yeah.
so we discussed some of the challenges in the work now, and I think we could go on ad nauseam about it even more because I think there's so much more to be said about the layered experiences we're having now and the complexity of navigating it. But I want to think about the future. So as you're looking towards the future in your space of international conflict and resolution and peace building, what do you see as a glimmer of hope and possibility? What and even if there's a resource, a book that you say, I would read this to help you think about this too, that if you have anything you'd like to offer around that too, Eileen. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in terms of, uh, I mean, in terms of international conflict resolution, if that's what you're asking me.
Right, yeah, yes, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Sure.
a couple of thoughts.
Yeah.
Again, we just had this conversation with colleagues last week. So
Mm,
I have some ideas that came out of that, which is nice. So it's not just my own
mm,
brain. Um, First is the importance of, again, supporting work at the local level. Um, there are so many people working in communities and at the state, in the United States, at the state level, as
yeah.
well as at the municipal level, to to pay attention to where points of contention are
Mm,
and anticipate how to manage those well and diffuse escalation. And the challenge is to find those people. And sometimes they don't want to be found, to be perfectly honest. They want to stay under the radar. Understood. Uh,
sure.
there may be times when you simply don't want your work to be made public. But to the extent that there can be support for that work at the local and whatever subnational, et cetera, level, we should definitely be doing it. I think number two is, and this was an interesting idea that came up at our meeting.
Mhm.
During the Cold War,
Yep.
there were two superpowers. That was
Mhm.
not that long ago.
Not at all.
I'm sorry, folks, but that really wasn't that long ago. And there was a worry, and this was where the nuclear freeze movement came from. There was a worry that would escalate to global annihilation. And that was a real threat and a real worry that people had. I think people are also feeling that now. Maybe not in the same way for the same reasons, but also feeling that there are dire threats. And during those years, there were many people who convened conversations among those power centers behind the scenes to talk about how to, again, mitigate and prevent escalation. Maybe it's time to do that now. You know that one of the most famous in the Cold War era was called the Pugwash meetings. And this was at a conference center, I believe it's in New Hampshire, called Pugwash. And they brought together well-placed people from the United States and the Soviet Union. And that conversation went on for 20 years.
Wow.
And they helped to dampen down some of the escalatory processes that were happening, not always successfully. But anyway, we may be needing to do this again. And I'm saying this out of hope, and I think it's probably already happening, but it should be happening more.
Yes, no, thank you. Not everything has to be like, for social media, right? So
that's correct. That's correct.
Not everything has to be for social media.
That's correct.
Thank you,
You're
Professor,
so welcome.
for saying yes to this conversation. I know initially we were still working out all the details, but you earlier on said, yes, I will show up. And so thank you for showing up. Thank you for your contributions to Tufts as a community, to our society as a whole. I appreciate you as a human, as a leader, and as a person that deeply cares about, the peace for all and the possibility for all. Please give us your feedback on today's conversation. Today's session will be recorded, as all the others have been recorded. We will eventually have those up and posted, as Sean said earlier, and made available as a resource for us to use beyond this moment. And then finally, register for our next conversation in the last for this academic year on May 7th with Dean Dana Cunningham and Dean Tisch College of Arts and Science, Tisch College of Civic Life, and also Dean Christina Economist, who's the Dean of Friedman School of Nutrition. Thank you all for joining us. Take great care of yourselves, take care of each other, as I said again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Joys of Leadership. Take great care. Thanks again, Eileen. Appreciate you. Thanks
for all your work as well. You're marvelous.
Oh, appreciate you. Thank you. Be well, everyone.
Bye.
Ciao.